So when we were finding the pH of strong acid solutions, all we had to do was add up the H plus contributions and then take the negative log of that to find the pH. However, in weak acid solutions, it's a little more complicated. So we're going to have to solve an equilibrium problem to get the answer. So make sure you remember how to solve ice problems. So the 6 basic steps to calculating the pH of weak acid solutions is to first, again, list the major species in solution. And then from those major species, choose which ones will produce the most H+. And then write the balanced equations for every reaction that can produce H+. And then from those balanced equations, you can determine which one will produce the most. So once you choose that equilibrium to focus on, then you need to make an ice chart and just solve it like any normal equilibrium problem. Except that for weak acids and bases, since the equilibrium constant is going to be very small, you can pretty much always ignore the minus x or plus x terms with the 5% rule. So then once you solve for x, you can calculate the concentration of H+ and then find the pH. So here we have a solution of 1 molar HCN and 5 molar HNO2. So these are both weak acids, so they don't dissociate very much in water, which means the concentration of the ionized forms, which would be H+, Cn-, and H+ and NO2-, relatively small compared to the concentrations of these original species, because again they do not dissociate very much in water. So major species in solution are then HCN, HNO2, and H2O. And these can all produce H+, because these two are acids, and H2O undergoes autoionization to produce H+ and OH-. So here are the balanced equations for all of these H+ producing equilibriums. And then from here, we look at the Ka values to determine which one will dominate the H+ production. And as you can see, for HNO2, the Ka is much larger than that of HCN or the autoionization of water. So we can assume that HNO2 is the only major source of H+ protons. So the pH of the whole solution will basically depend only on this equilibrium here. So we write the equilibrium expression for this reaction, and then we make an ice chart. So initial concentration is 5 molar of HNO2, and we have 0 of H+ or NO2-. So obviously it will shift to the right to reach equilibrium. And these are all in a 1-to-1 molar ratio. So if this decreases by x molar, then these two will both increase by x molar, since they are all the same ratio. So then we get equilibrium concentrations in terms of x, and then plug those into the equilibrium expression. And then since the Ka is very small, we can assume that the equilibrium will not shift that much to the right. So x must be a very small number. So we can, instead of 5 minus x, we can ignore this part and approximate it as 5. So then solving for x, we get that x is equal to 4.5 times 10 to the negative 2. So this is a very small number compared to the initial 5 molar, so approximation was justified. If you calculate it, then this should be much less than 5% of our initial amount. So the concentration of H+ is just equal to X, which is 4.5 times 10 to the negative 2 molar. And then the pH of the solution is the negative log of the concentration of H, so it turns out to be 1.35. So as expected, it's very acidic since we have all these acids here. So the percent dissociation is the concentration of the original acid that dissociated over the concentration, the initial concentration of the acid. So in the previous example, we had 5 molar HNO2, and we found that X, the amount that dissociated, was 4.5 times 10 to the negative 2. So putting these in this ratio and multiplying by 100%, we find that the percent dissociation is 0.9%, which is much less than 5%. Remember that in order to make this approximation, ignoring the minus x, this term has to be less than 5%. So now we're going to talk about bases. So strong bases are those that completely dissociate in water to release hydroxide ions. So all of these strong bases have hydroxide ions in them. And these strong bases are all the alkali metal hydroxides, because remember, alkali metals are always soluble, even with hydroxide, because hydroxides are usually insoluble. And then we have calcium, barium, and strontium hydroxides. So these are all the strong bases. So again, just like strong acids, finding the pH of a strong base is relatively easy. So we have 0.02 molar of calcium hydroxide. And since calcium hydroxide is a strong base, it will completely dissociate. Notice how this is a single arrow. So the dissociation reaction basically goes to completion. So it dissociates into Ca2 plus and 2 OH minus. So notice from these coefficients, whatever initial concentration of calcium hydroxide was, the concentration of the hydroxide ion will be double that. Because for every 1 mole of calcium hydroxide dissolved in water, 2 moles of hydroxide ion are produced. So in the solution, the concentration of hydroxide will be 0.04 molar. So then we can calculate the pOH, which is just the negative log of the concentration of OH minus. So pOH is 1.4. And then remember that the pH and pOH always add to 14. So the pH must be 12.6. So not all bases actually contain hydroxide, but they can still produce hydroxide ions in solution by taking a proton from the water. Remember that in the Bronsted-Lowry model, bases are substances which accept a proton. And also, water is amphoteric, so when it's reacting with a weak base, water acts as the acid. So here's the reaction with ammonia and water. So water acts as the acid, it donates one of its protons to ammonia, which accepts it, so it's the base. So ammonia with that extra proton becomes NH4 plus ammonium, and then since the water lost AH plus, it becomes OH minus. So you can see how weak bases react with water to produce hydroxide ion. So many of those weak bases consist of a nitrogen atom that has a lone pair, because it can use this lone pair on the nitrogen atom to bond with the extra proton that it's accepting. So the general reaction for a weak base with water is we have a base B plus H2O, and then the water gives its proton to the base to form BH plus, and then since the water lost its proton, it becomes hydroxide, OH minus. So the equilibrium expression, and for a reaction of a weak base we used Kb, is the concentration of BH plus, the conjugate acid, times the concentration of hydroxide over the initial concentration, or not, the concentration of the initial base. So again, the base B is competing with this base hydroxide for control of the proton. But hydroxide is a very strong base, so it's very attracted to any H plus ions. So usually the base will lose the battle with hydroxide, and the equilibrium will lie further to the left, and the Kb is very small, which is why they're called weak bases. So if we have a 1 molar solution of methylamine, which is CH3NH2, again, if you draw the Lewis structure for this, you'd find that the nitrogen has a lone pair, which is a characteristic of a weak base. So the major species, since this is a weak base, it does not dissociate very much. The major species are the methylamine and the water. So the contribution of hydroxide ion from the water is much less than the contribution from methylamine. So the main reaction we're going to look at is the dissociation of methylamine, or the reaction of methylamine with water. So we write the equilibrium expression and then make an ice chart. So again, all of these are in a 1-to-1 ratio. That's usually the case for acid-base dissociations. So then we plug these equilibrium concentrations into the equilibrium expression. And then since Kb is very small, the power is to the -4th. We ignore this minus x term by the 5% rule. So that makes solving for x much easier, and we get that x is equal to 2.1 times 10 to the -2. And then from there we calculate the concentration of hydroxide, which is just equal to x, and then the pOH, and then from the pOH we can calculate the pH, which is 12.32. So it's basic, just as we expect.